What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the Season 1 finale of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, an episode called Alloyed, directed by Wayne Che Yip and written by Jennifer Hutchison, as well as the showrunners J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay. So, the show's over, or not over, but the season at least is over. They're off shooting Season 2, and now we have a chance, for at least a year or two, to digest and internalize what we've seen, and we can endlessly debate the good, the bad, and the atrocious. And I think if you wanted to be very kind, you could just say that this is a wildly uneven show where hopefully everybody involved will learn a lot from their missteps and hopefully do better next time. I will be not eagerly looking forward to Season 2, but I'll come back and watch Season 2 and see what it's all about. I mean, it's not every day that you get to see a show very loosely based on the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. But from my point of view, this show continues to suffer from a variety of flaws and weaknesses where just it seems like every step of the way, whenever there's an opportunity for greatness or for a big soaring moment or for emotional resonance or just like a deep emotional attachment to the characters, that they just through incompetence or through, just a lack of talent, will manage to trip up and miss the mark. And it's just a series of missed opportunities, one after another. And I guess my most lingering impression of this show at this point is that the writers feel like people who understood and appreciated about 3 to 5% of what Peter Jackson's original trilogy had to offer. And they basically took that very thin, very shallow understanding of the material and then just expanded that into a show, because there's so many moments and lines and beats that feel almost like diluted, piss-poor replicas or recreations of certain beats and moments from the original trilogy, but with none of the depth of feeling, none of the poetry, and definitely none of the depth or the lore that supports the story, that gives the story additional emotional resonance. Because with this episode, I really started to take notice of this strategy or tactic that keeps being employed by the writers, and it's a tactic that I hate, where they'll give us what on the surface should be a big emotional moment, and then they'll contradict it or erase it or eradicate it with a double cross or a big reveal that contradicts it, either in the same episode or in the episode that comes right after. And let me give you a few examples. In the previous episode, we saw the Southlanders screaming strength to the king and strength to the Southlands and all that nonsense. It's supposed to be like the big, king coming home moment. And for me, it was already paper thin to begin with, because the Southlands doesn't even exist in Tolkien, and I didn't really have that much investment in the idea of a king of the so-called Southlands. But I took the show at face value that they were trying to get us invested in this culture. But now we learned that Halbrand, as has been predicted all along by many sharp-eyed viewers, is in fact Sauron. So all those emotional beats about him being the king and so on and so forth are all just washed away and squandered. And I'm glad I never got emotionally invested in any of it, because I would be feeling a little bit betrayed and annoyed if I had kind of taken the bait. And another example of this problem is when these three witches finally catch up with the stranger and they're like, you are Sauron. Let us be evil together and do evil things and all that nonsense. And I was like, all right, whatever. If he's going to try to be Sauron, I neither like it nor dislike it, but I'll just roll with it. And then we learn 20 minutes later, they're like, oh no, he's the other one. And then they get in a fight and he kills them. And my feeling moving forward is that anytime there's a big emotional beat or surprise or plot twist or whatever, I'm always going to be skeptical, because I feel like if nothing really matters, if everything can just be contradicted or washed away, either in the same episode or whatever comes next, why allow myself to get attached to anything? It reminds me of kind of cheesy, mainstream, generic TV style double crosses that get employed in a lot of kind of run-of-the-mill shows, but Tolkien shouldn't be run-of-the-mill. Tolkien his story should give you almost like a feeling of religious awe when you're experiencing them. They shouldn't feel like just some old cop show or like, oh my God, you rascal, you double-crossed me. But that's the way the show is starting to feel. And another critical failing of this show for me is that they keep pulling stuff from the Third Age and putting it in the Second Age. And I'm sure a lot of people out there are like, oh my God, who gives a shit, you big giant nerd. But the reason Tolkien matters, the reason these books have been beloved for so many decades, the reason why they keep basing cartoons and movies and video games and comics and TV shows on this world is that the history and the lore and the stories, they matter. The texts absolutely matter. And when you have a really rich, dense, just incredibly sophisticated world, and you just start changing things and breaking things, well, then that whole spell, that whole illusion of this world where we can get lost inside of, it just gets destroyed. And the 5 wizards were sent to Middle-earth in the Third Age as a result of the fact that Sauron was starting to take shape again, and the powers that be across the sea felt like the people of Middle-earth would need some help, which is how you get Gandalf and Saruman and Radagast, as well as the 2 blue wizards. So they basically came roughly thousands of years after this character, the Stranger, has arrived in the show. And for people out there who don't read the text, the Istari were part of the Maiar. And the Maiar are basically really powerful spirits, like one notch down from the Valar who created the world. Like people like Morgoth, they were the Valar. But the Maiar are people like Gandalf, Saruman, the Balrogs, as well as Sauron. They're all extremely powerful. They're just not the most powerful people in this fictional setting. But the Istari were very specific Maiar who were sent to Middle-earth to help out, where obviously Sauron and the Balrogs are bad guys, so on and so forth. And I could have lived with the idea of the Stranger just being a Maiar who is somehow being sent to Middle-earth to help out. But they very specifically mention the word Istar, and so there are only 5 Istar, and they're the 2 blue wizards who we know almost nothing about. There's Radagast, there's Saruman, and there's Gandalf. And in a very cynical fashion, I've been predicting for many episodes that the Stranger would in fact turn out to be Gandalf, and that his whole love affair with the hobbits would begin with Nori, and that his understanding of the world and his investment in the world would all be shaped by Nori's kind of tutelage of him, or teachings that she shares with him, which would then mean that indirectly all the accomplishments of Gandalf in the Third Age and the Lord of the Rings and the War of the Ring, etc., could all be indirectly traced back to Nori. And that's very clearly starting to take shape. They have not yet named him Gandalf or Mithrandir or any of those names, but obviously that's what they're going for. And I would be shocked and amazed if they decided to wash it away. But who knows? They've washed away a bunch of other crap in the show. But getting back to this whole idea of pulling things from the Third Age and putting it in the Second Age, Tolkien did write about the Second Age, not as much as the other 2 ages, but he did write quite a bit, and it was primarily concerned with the forging of the Rings of Power and the downfall of Numenor. And that's plenty of material to work with, even if they were having to kind of embellish certain scenes or zig and zag and add new characters. But that's more than enough material to work with all roads leading to the last alliance of elves and men, where they take down Sauron and cut the ring from his hand. They could have easily squeezed a few seasons of television out of that, but it's almost like they kind of examined what material was there and felt unsatisfied and started pulling things that don't belong to them. And it just drives me fucking crazy. A show called The Lord of the Rings should not contradict the text of The Lord of the Rings. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, with the infinite resources at their disposal, they should have just hired a bunch of writers to come up with like 4 or 5 really good ideas for new fictional settings and been like, all right, let's put all our eggs in that basket and create our own world from scratch. Because if you don't care about being true to The Lord of the Rings, why buy like the rights to the name in the first place? But I've been going quite a bit at this point without offering any praise of any kind. I said this would be an episode or a review where I celebrate the good, the bad, and the atrocious. There was one moment that I kind of sort of liked, where it was a vague, indirect moment to a line from The Lord of the Rings, where they're referring to the territory known as Rhûn, which is, there's very little written about it in the text of Tolkien. But these witches, they talk about how in the Far East, it's where the stars are strange. And that actually is a line in Tolkien, but is uttered by somebody else. But at a minimum, they tried to actually have one detail that was true to Tolkien. So high five for them pulling one line from the book, but even though it was totally taken out of context. The original line was actually spoken by Aragorn to Boromir, where he said, "I have crossed many mountains and many rivers and trodden many plains, even into the far countries of Rhûn and Harad, where the stars are strange." And I can remember as like a high schooler reading that and being like, oh my God, like what's so strange about that? And just like my imagination is exploding with all these possibilities. And because it's never explored in Tolkien, our imagination always like will kind of fill in the gaps with something truly otherworldly and great. But that is where the Stranger and Nori are headed in season 2. So they can pretty much do whatever the fuck they want with that terrain, apart from the fact that there is a sea of Rhûn there. But whatever they do, I'm sure they'll find some way to annoy me. They won't be annoying me based on contradicting the text, but I'm sure they'll find some other way to get under my skin. Well, while we're on the subject of the stranger, let's talk about the witches. I think that was a huge missed opportunity. And coincidentally, I paused the show during one of their scenes, and I got to see the actresses' names as well as the character names, and they apparently are the Dweller, the Nomad, and the Ascetic. And the Dweller, I have to say, I was starting to get kind of like sexually attracted to her, which I don't know what that says about me. Everybody calling her Eminem, but she's a very beautiful woman in a lot of ways. But why did they think that this meteor, which crashed into the planet, might be Sauron? I mean, at the end of the first age, right, with the downfall of Morgoth, Sauron hid away. He went into hiding. He did not want to surrender, and he bided his time, and he waited for centuries, and then he started to kind of rear his ugly head again and started making mischief. Why would his followers think that he would be basically this kind of like befuddled guy with amnesia that would come blasting down out of the sky? And they could have had an explanation of some kind, but rather than give us an explanation, they just kill these characters off. And I just would have loved to know a little bit more about why they thought that was Sauron. And the way they realized he's not Sauron was just so ham-fisted when the stranger says, "I'm good." I mean, the dialogue in this show continues to be by far the biggest weakness. It's like they got some intern who eats edibles all day, who like saw The Lord of the Rings 20 years ago and like, give us some lines that sound Tolkien-esque, but "I'm good." I mean, that was just idiotic. But when the witches realize that he is the other, once again, it's like, how would they know that he is the other? Because, once again, going back to the lore of Tolkien, none of the 5 wizards had ever come to Middle-earth prior to their arrival in the Third Age, so why would they have any knowledge of him as the other or as like a counterpart to Sauron? Anyway, rather than give us any sort of explanation, they just kill these characters off. And so, like many aspects of the show, I was just left feeling frustrated and unsatisfied. And I was talking earlier about stupid pump fakes. Even in the context of the witches and the stranger, there's a stupid pump fake where one pretends to be Nori, and it's like, if they're showing up to serve him, why lure him in with this disguise? Once again, the writers write these scenes as if they don't expect us to remember anything that happened only a few minutes prior, and it drives me totally insane. So I'm looking over my notes at some of the other scenes and lines and moments that I need to discuss, and I'm just feeling this kind of weary exhaustion where none of it seems like fun or exciting to discuss in any way, shape, or form. But I'll just say that when it came to Halbrand being Sauron and seducing Celebrimbor and sharing knowledge with him and creating the 3 elven rings of power, that's one of the biggest disappointments of the season. And I know some people are going to be like, "Oh my God, it's so cool. We finally got to see how the 3 rings were made." That could have been many episodes where we see Sauron in the form of Anatar slowly but surely working his way into elven society, because in the material written by Tolkien, we see how some are very skeptical of him, like Gil-galad, but that some like Celebrimbor, because they're so greedy for the knowledge of how to craft these incredible items, allow themselves to be seduced by Sauron. And the seduction and the creation takes like 5 minutes. And it's like, well, goddamn, like, there's so little written about this period. Why not take the stuff that actually is written and make sure that you include all of it? It's just a huge, giant, squandered opportunity. And I hope that in season 2, at a minimum, we'll get to see some lengthy scenes where Sauron is creating the 7 rings for the dwarves and the 9 rings for men, who end up becoming the ring wraiths, obviously. But I really hate how the creation of these rings was kind of roped in with this really silly subplot of where this idea of like the light of the Eldar is fading, and that if we don't get exposed to a giant fuck ton of mithril, that we're all going to become mortal and die, blah, blah, blah. They didn't need to invent this whole subterfuge that they would use for Elrond trying to manipulate Durin, even though he was manipulating him without his knowledge. That whole subplot between the dwarves and the elves was just so, I don't know, just so ill-conceived. And we didn't even get to see the dwarves this episode. And I'm sure there's some fans who are like, wait a second, where are the dwarves? Those are my favorite characters. And that stupid pump fake with the Balrog in one of the previous episodes. Obviously, we'll have to wait until season 2 to see more. But I honestly don't give a shit, because the Balrog should not even be in this show. But as I struggle to come up with compliments for this show, I will say this. I kind of like Charlie Vickers' performance as Halbrand now that he is shown his true colors. I mean, there was that one ridiculous scene where he's trying to mess with Galadriel's mind, where they're on the raft and they're both screaming at each other, where I just exploded with laughter. It was so melodramatic and so stupid. Felt like a cheesy, like, high school play or something like that. Apart from that scene, though, I kind of like seeing him in evil mode, and seeing him walking into Mordor at the end, that was at least an interesting shot. I can't wait to see how he interacts with people there, and as he starts constructing Barad-dûr. And I really want to see how he will manipulate the various 9 human beings that he kind of brings under his influence when he gives them those rings, and we get to slowly watch them become the ring wraiths. And of course, the ring wraiths, they slowly became wraiths, but in the context of the show, I'm sure it'll be like an instantaneous transformation, because this show likes to rush to everything. If they can take a shortcut, or if they can basically cheat their way to an outcome, they always do. But another thing the show really needs to stop doing is trying to recreate certain moments and beats from the Jackson trilogy by stealing lines or kind of repurposing lines. Like, perfect example would be when the stranger and Nori are about to head off towards Rune, and he says something about, like, when in doubt, always follow your nose, which obviously was in Fellowship of the Ring when Gandalf's like, oh, it's that way. Like, when in doubt, or the air doesn't smell so foul. When in doubt, always follow your nose. It makes this show, it kind of underlines and really calls attention to how it's such a pale imitation of that trilogy. And like I keep saying, it feels like the people who make this show are people who, like, saw Jackson's trilogy once, barely understood it, barely appreciated it, took the most superficial aspects and tried to just take those ingredients and become a show, as opposed to going back to the text. And there was a great story, I think it was by Christopher Lee, behind the scenes on The Lord of the Rings, where he said whenever there was a break, whenever they were setting up for a shot or setting up lights, he would look over and he'd always see Peter Jackson just going through the book, going through the text, just completely, like, going vertical, as my old English teacher would say, and just really doing the deep dive. And we can debate until the end of time to what degree Jackson was successful, but at a minimum, he was really trying to create the spirit of Tolkien, or reinterpret the spirit of Tolkien through his lens as a filmmaker. And I just get none of that with this. I get the feeling that these two writers are basically like con artists who tricked Amazon and the Tolkien estate into believing that they were the guys for the job. And it's like the greatest con ever pulled in the history of entertainment. And I'm starting to feel like this show is like the greatest creative misfire of the last couple of years. Not because it's like the worst show of the last couple of years, because there's plenty of bad shows out there, but the greatest creative misfire because of the near infinite resources at their disposal, this beautifully written world that was at their fingertips, and they haven't capitalized on any of it. And as I'm going over my notes, I realized I haven't mentioned anything about Tar Palantir warning Elendil's daughter about how the island will fall if the old ways are not restored. And that'll obviously be a big subplot in season 2, but it really won't get underway until Sauron is defeated in Middle-earth for the first time and then dragged back to Numenor, where he starts to kind of seduce and corrupt the culture and turning them over, or convincing them to start worshiping Morgoth, which leads to Elendil and his sons and the faithful leaving and going to Middle-earth. And while I have very little hope that they will capture that whole storyline well, who knows? Maybe over the next year or two, some very wise person at Amazon will realize, you know what? We are just fucking this up. Let's just press pause. Let's fire the writers. Let's do some rewrites. And let's go back and reshoot some episodes. I mean, you never know. A lot of crazy things have happened in the world of entertainment. Over the next year or two, they could bring in an entirely new creative team. And who knows? Maybe season 2 of the show would just be absolutely astonishing, but that will be absolutely impossible if they don't bring in better writers. And I've made a lot of disparaging comments about writers on this show, and I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, like, well, who are you to say what's good writing or bad writing? And that is totally fair. However, the reason so many fantasy fans are critical of the writing of this show is because they have opinions that are informed by and supported by many, many years of reading great fantasy texts. So as a way of wrapping up this video, I just wanted to give a shout out to some of my favorite fantasy writers who are not J.R.R. Tolkien, so that between now and season 2 of this show, if you're looking for some more fantasy to consume, apart from shows like House of the Dragon, which I think is wildly superior. Here are some of my favorite fantasy writers, and I probably just need to do like a top 10 video, but I'm just going to list these guys alphabetically with no real order or preference. But Joe Abercrombie, R. Scott Bakker, Steven Erikson, Robert E. Howard, Robert Jordan, Mark Lawrence, Fritz Leiber, George R. R. Martin, Michael Moorcock, Patrick Rothfuss, Brandon Sanderson, Andrzej Sapkowski, and I'm always on the lookout for more. I'm always discovering more. I usually read a couple new fantasy books in any given year, and a lot of these writers have ongoing series that I'm still working my way through. I'm actually reading Prince of Fools by Mark Lawrence right now. So while I think the writing on this particular fantasy enterprise completely, totally sucks, the good news is there's a lot of great fantasy writing out there for people to enjoy. And one last point that I want to make, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy was successful for a variety of reasons, but what I love was how it appealed to a wide range of audiences. You had like 5-year-old kids who had never been exposed to this world at all, and then you had like mean old bastards who had been reading the texts on an annual basis for many, many years, who were also getting into the spirit of things. And everybody's got their gripes about the changes in his interpretation, etc., but he managed to throw out a very wide net. I feel like this show is throwing out a much smaller net where it's only appealing to a small percentage of that fan base. It's appealing to the same fan base who thought that Peter Jackson's Hobbit films were just fine. And spoiler alert, Peter Jackson's Hobbit films fucking sucked. They weren't as bad as the show, but they weren't nearly as good as the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And I've seen a lot of people pushing back on the idea that any of these shows or movies or projects can be criticized in any way because so many craftspeople and artisans and technicians have invested so much time and so much blood, sweat, and tears into these productions that we should all just kind of just shut the fuck up and just enjoy it. And I could not disagree more. When you put something out into the world, people can love it, they can celebrate it, they can chop it up, they can use it for toilet paper, they can do whatever they want with it, and you can take their opinions and you can fight them or you can ignore them or wrestle with them or whatever the case might be, but art and storytelling should never be beyond discussion or beyond criticism. And if people want to criticize J.R.R. Tolkien himself, go to it. You probably won't enjoy a lot of success, but nobody is beyond reproach, nobody's beyond criticism. And when people take something that's beloved, that's been around for a very long time, and screw it up, I think there's no better opportunity for criticizing something. And so I just completely, totally reject this idea that because people worked hard on this, that you can't criticize it. I have worked hard on crummy little YouTube videos in the past, and people have just eaten me alive in the comments section. And that's totally fine. I have put something out into the world and people can say whatever the hell they like. And that's the way that it always should be. And so in closing, I'll just say the world as depicted in this show so far does not feel like Tolkien. All the qualities that I love in Tolkien are absent from this show. It feels inauthentic. And I hate it. And I managed to get through this review without bawling or crying or getting angry. So for anybody who was hoping that I'd have a total temper tantrum and meltdown on this video, I apologize that it did not deliver, but I'll do better with season 2. But before I go, I have a very important question to ask. This question comes from Manscaped, the official sponsor of my podcast, Wrong Reel. Does your happy trail look more like a happy highway? Does your bush peek out over your fence? If you had to even think about the answer, you need the revolutionary products from Manscaped. Success is when preparation meets opportunity, and Manscaped's Platinum Package will make sure you're prepared when opportunity strikes. Join the 6 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped by going to manscaped.com for 20% off plus free shipping with the code WRONGREEL. And that is Wrong Reel in all caps, and I'll leave a link in the description below. So check out Manscaped and check out my podcast, Wrong Reel. But I think I've said enough for this one evening. It's 2 a.m. and I haven't even started editing yet, so it's time to get cracking on that. So thank you so much for watching and listening and so on and so forth. Give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, hunt me down on Twitter @GeekinOut. But I can't thank you enough for watching. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.